Hello, authors. I'm Bill Kenower, editor-in-chief of Author Magazine, and this month I want to do something a little bit different. I'm going to offer a retrospective on some of the authors I've interviewed over the last few years and talk about what I've learned, what I've taken away from those conversations. And I'd like to start where all writing careers begin, at that moment before we know where this thing is going, how it's going to work, if it's going to work. I thought of this when I talked to the children's book author and illustrator Elizabeth Rose-Stanton, who had had a full career prior to starting her career as an author. She'd been an architect, she'd been an illustrator. Then later in life, she thought she might want to illustrate books, and she had put up a bunch of her illustrations at to be judged at a conference of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And what she hoped would happen, I thought, from that experience of putting her work up to be judged, was very interesting and very telling and very useful in the end. Have a listen.
And there's like 250 portfolios in that show. So I just was hoping somebody, I was setting goals, and my goal was that somebody might say something kind about, even in passing, about my portfolio. Well, about a week after I got back, I got a call from a New York literary agent who had picked up my card. She'd seen my portfolio and she liked it. And so she said, "What else you got?" And so I told her about Henny. And she said, "I think you got something there." And about a week after that, I got an email with a contract.
I think one of your gifts is that you had low expectations.
I had no expectations.
Even better.
I know.
I had huge
and
expectations,
I tell them that too.
And screwed me up to no end.
See, it does. It does.
Oh, it screws you. It's a curse.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that I talk to people about that expectation thing. Don't have expectations. It'll get you into trouble.
Yeah. So once you decide you want to be a writer, once you're crafting these novels, now the issue of how do I do it is often comes up. How do you find the story? How do you fit your characters into it? There's a lot we could say on the craft of writing, but I sat down with Andre Dubus, the novelist who some of you may be familiar with, either from his books, also from his keynote speeches at the Pacific Northwest Writers Conference. And I asked him about the relationship between what we call plot and character, and how someone who writes the sorts of books he does, which are really generally described as character-driven, finds the action of his story. And I thought his answer was informative and fascinating.
Well, let's look at those two words, story and plot. I love what Janet Burroway said. She said that story is a causal sequence of events with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Plot is how we arrange those events. So the key word for me, so we have to begin with story. I think too often, and this is certainly the case if you're in a writing program or you're in a writing group, and people are, looking at your work on a fairly regular basis. I think that oftentimes we plot too soon. We anticipate our audience prematurely, when we should really give ourselves permission to find the story, to find that causal sequence of events. And the key word for me, it seems, Bill, is causal. So what's causality? Well, it's causality, bank robber puts a gun in your face and then you're in a car being chased by the cops. I mean, all that stuff's causal. But so is, in James Joyce's The Dead, the snow falling out the window that gets the woman to remember her dead lover, which triggers her tears, which triggers her husband's questions. All of those sensual details are causal. So for me, story is all about character because causation happens in characters. If I go deeply inside a character, and how do you go deeply? I was just talking about this today. The only way to go inside a character is you first have to give a damn. In other words, sometimes you start writing about a character and his or her situation, and you think you're curious about it, but you're not really. You're only half curious or a little curious when you want to be writing about this or that. And if I've learned nothing over the years, I've learned that the writing is larger than the writer. In the same way you can't choose what, who you fall in love with, you can't choose what you're curious about.
All right, so you've written a book, and let's say you found an agent, and happy day, you're publishing it. That's great. You're going to see it in bookstores. Maybe you'll go around to those bookstores and give talks. Maybe you won't. The publishing experience will be very different for all different kinds of writers. But I sat down with the Australian novelist Graham Simpson, who wrote the breakout international bestseller, The Rosie Project. And I talked to him about that, what he hoped for when he published his first book. I thought his answer was priceless and healthy and just the sort of thing I think to some degree every writer should hold in mind when they publish their first book. Have a listen.
I had the conversation with Hannah Kent, who wrote a book called Burial Rights, which has been very successful, particularly as literary fiction. And look, we both said, and look, all authors I think say this, our goal was to be published by a mainstream publisher,
Right.
and have the dream that one day you're going to walk into a bookstore and in the back shelf, spine out, there will be your book. Oh, can I sign this? I say, better not. We may need to send it back. But yeah, that's the limit of the ambition.
Right.
And in fact, at the point where I got that publishing contract, I actually looked at myself in the mirror, almost literally, and said, "Okay, Graham, you've got what you set out to do. Everything else is a bonus, is a plus. You will never, you're going to have 5 minutes of saying we didn't make #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. We made 2 and just actually haven't. We made 2 and just didn't quite do it. And you could have your 5 minutes like, But don't ever lose sleep over it or feel bad about it. Everything we're doing is exceeding expectations."
So you've got a book on the shelf. Maybe you've written another one. Maybe you're starting to gain a little momentum. Maybe you're starting to build a readership. Maybe people are writing about you. Maybe you go on Author Magazine, you get interviewed. Who knows? You're starting to get some attention. Maybe you're starting to accrue something resembling fame, although I don't know if that word ever applies to writers, but maybe it does. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with success, with marketing? What do you do with that? Well, about in June of 2018, I sat down with the novelist and musician, Willie Vlaughton. And we talked about this because things were going well for old Willie. He, very humble guy, played in a band, didn't want to be the lead singer, but it just sort of fell to him. He wrote these sort of gritty, quiet novels that had grown in their readership and now even had a couple movies that were being made about those. So I asked him about that. What do you think? What do you think about being the guy on stage? What do you think about being the center of attention? I thought his answer was awesome and worth listening to. So have a listen.
Thing I think about is like if it does good, then maybe they'll let me do my next one. That's the only.
All right, so you keep the expectations low.
Well, I mean, I love writing. I mean, I don't want to get a job. I'm starting to get lazy. I haven't had like a real job in a while.
Yeah.
And so no, I don't like being on stage or any of that stuff. But I'll do it all day long if that means that I can just work on my novels with the seriousness that. That's the one fun thing is once I got published and you're like, oh, you better not mess up. You got your shot.
Finally, I want to talk about how, to have success as a writer requires dedication, obviously. It requires finding the time, learning the craft, learning the business. There's a lot we do to create our own success. But I also think there's something in operation that helps prepare us for success that we have no control over whatsoever. It has certainly been true of my life. The time I spent telling stories as a boy, the kinds of things I told stories about, ended up years later being extremely helpful to me in the work I do now, even in the interviews I conduct. I, in many ways, was preparing for them long before I ever knew that I was doing them. And I thought of this when I interviewed R.L. Stine, he of the Goosebumps books. So millions and millions and millions of copies of these. It was never his plan to scare people. He just wanted to be a humorist. And yet, he has written all these books that have scared young people and delighted them. And so I started talking about the relationship between his childhood and the kinds of books he writes now. And he had to admit that there was some small line he might be able to draw. Have a listen. This might be too much of a reach, but when we were talking about the beginning of your writing life, back when you were a kid, back in Ohio, you said you were a very frightened kid at that time. And you're now scaring kids about that age. I don't want to put you on the couch, but do you think there's any connection there at all?
I don't know about that. I do think, it was a terrible way to be a kid.
It was a tough way to be a kid.
It was a tough way to be a kid.
Yeah.
But then when I started writing these books, I could remember what it felt like.
You remember what it felt like to be that age and afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You remember that feeling of panic.
Yeah.
And I could bring that feeling to the book. So I think it helped me write later on.
I think that's very helpful because, of course, the kids in the stories are always scared at some point, and you want to be able to connect to what that is to be that age and afraid as opposed to this age and afraid. It's different.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this little retrospective. Obviously, there is something I learned from all the conversations I've ever had with all the authors, not just these. And I encourage you to go back, and if you haven't watched them all, watch at least some more of them because they always offer some surprising tidbits. You never know what it is you need to hear, and maybe you'll hear it. But I'd like to offer this last bit of perspective today. The question of success and failure haunts a great many writers. It certainly did me. And it was part of the reason I started this magazine, to sort of explore that. What does success mean? What does failure mean? Does it exist, really? And the reason I wanted to focus on the things I learned from these conversations is because I had to finally replace the concept of failure with learning. That there really is no failure which suggests an end. There's only learning. There's only learning. And I have found that I can learn from every single interaction with every writer, with every person, but with every writer, whether a beginning writer or a #1 New York Times bestseller. I talk to them all, and I learn something from everybody. And so I encourage you to always look upon the experience as learning. Everything you're doing is learning. Everything you're doing is growing. There really is no failure. There's only growth. There's only growth. And when you can see it that way, you can pull away the fear that somehow your creative life can come to some kind of end because you lack some ineffable quality. You don't. Everybody has what it takes. Everybody's good enough. But everybody has to learn. So let the learning continue, and I promise, as I continue these conversations, I'll try to offer up the richest and deepest experiences so that you and I can both learn from them. Thanks.